Hello, type and typography fans. Welcome to Lecture 6, Grid Life. Today we're talking about grids, their origins, their use in organizing information and communicating from early civilization to the present. Our first slide here says Grid Life with small text reading loyal to the soil. What the slide is illustrating is two grids at work in a single InDesign document. So the first grid is this grid that we see with the purple and pink outline. It is 4 columns separated by gutters. This is called a document grid. The second grid we see are blue lines running horizontally across the page. This is called our baseline grid, and we'll notice that the words loyal to the soil are rested on a common baseline, as are the bottom baselines of our letter forms. It's a little bit tougher to see with a black letter typeface because there are deviations in order to create balance, but we can see across this baseline right here that our letters are resting on that baseline. So document grid holds the whole page together, and baseline grids keeps horizontal alignment across columns of text. So grids in graphic design are used to provide a foundation upon which information is organized, sort of like a scaffolding or a framework. And in this lecture, we're going to examine the early origins of grid-based design and trace its lineage to present-day applications. I have put together a glossary for you to go back and review later. All of these terms will be defined as we move through the lecture. So let's start with the origin of the grid. Since the dawn of human creativity, the grid has been a foundational tool for expressing ideas and organizing the world. From early human cave paintings featuring organized gridded patterns or lines to the arrangement of Egyptian hieroglyphs, the grid is a powerful organizational force, shaping information, space, and even entire societies. It is woven into some of humanity's greatest civilizations. For example, the meticulously planned city of Tenochtitlan was organized on a geometric grid with the Templo Mayor at the center. This temple was constructed around the same time as Notre Dame in Paris. So we're going to take a look through our timeline. We have Maltreviso, Spain, 40,000 years old, and we can see grid in line and pattern. Moving on to Egyptian hieroglyphs, this is 3250, 3100 BC. And we can see again, this information is organized in vertical columns or grids. To the city of Tenochtitlan, 1325. This is a concept drawing of what they believe Tenochtitlan looked like from the sky, based on the footprints that are left in archaeological sites and written descriptions. What we see at the center here, this is Templo Mayor. So when you see the Notre Dame in Paris and you are impressed by that level of architecture, know that it also existed here in what is now Mexico City. These are extremely sophisticated architectural buildings. And then onto the Hiawatha Belt. This is an artifact from the Iroquois Confederacy, approximately 1400. And again, you can see a grid pattern throughout the design. So let's talk about some of these grids, the math of these grids. Don't get scared. Um, let's start with talking about the Fibonacci sequence. So a mathematical sequence, the Fibonacci sequence is a mathematical sequence where each number is the sum of the two preceding numbers. In art and design, it's often used to create a natural feeling proportion of rhythm and spatial relationship. So I'm going to explain this a little bit. We can see here's a series of equations producing Fibonacci numbers. So if we go 1 plus 0 is 1, and then we're going to transpose that down here and add it to itself. 1 and 1 is 2. Transpose down again. 1 and 2 is 3. 2 and 3 is 5. 3 and 5 is 8. 5 and 8 is 13. 8 and 13 is 21. Why do we care about this? Well, this series of numbers can be translated into form. And so what we see here is a 1 by 1 on top of a 1 by 1 equals 2 by 2. And if we add 1 and 2, we get 3, 3 by 3. And if we add 2 and 3, we get 5, 5 by 5. And if we add 5 and 3, we get 8. This is 8 by 8. And if we add 8 and 5, we get 13, 13 by 13. So when we express these numbers as squares and then begin stacking them upon each other proportionally, we wind up with this grid. And if we took our pencil and drew curves from one corner to the next corner, we would get this. So this is the Fibonacci spiral. Why do we like this? This is the mathematical expression of nature and the universe. You will find these proportions and this spiral throughout nature over and over and over again. And artists, we understand what is beautiful and we know how to transpose what we see into something that we create. And I don't know which came first, the artist replicating nature and then discovering the grid, or discovering this Fibonacci sequence or grid and then um, designing toward that. But my instinct says that we do it instinctively. And I say this because in my Design 1 classes, I will have students design a poster. I will not give them the Fibonacci grid. And once they have their posters laid out, I then airdrop to everybody a copy of a Illustrator Fibonacci grid at 18 by 24. I then have them lay them out over the posters they just designed. And more often than not, their layouts are following this grid. So vertically, it might be the most important part of the image is up here. Type is resting somewhere in this space. So we tend to apply these proportions visually because we understand that they are beautiful. You can see here in the Mona Lisa, Leonardo da Vinci, he was really big on the Fibonacci sequence in the grid. Vitruvian Man, that man spread out, that is a grid that illustrates proportion. We can also see the same or similar grid um, proportions and ratios used in this painting by Piet Mondrian, 1943, titled Broadway Boogie. So in modernity, the modern grid, humans have been using gridded systems to understand, map, and build the world for thousands of years. It is visible in ancient mathematics, early cartography, manuscript layout traditions, indigenous urban planning, and Renaissance studies of proportion. Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, for example, are filled with grid structures used to study anatomy and perspective, and civilizations across the globe have used grid-based planning long before European modernism emerged and started speaking more explicitly about the grid. So you may have heard the term the Swiss grid or the modernist grid. So while the term Swiss grid is often used, as we can see, the grid itself is not modern or uniquely Swiss. After World War II, artists and designers who had taken refuge in Switzerland began to formally codify. That means code, name, articulate, and systematize practices that had already existed for centuries. So what they were really doing was translating what humans were doing in an instructional way. So designers like Joseph Mueller-Brockmann, Max Bill, and Emil Reuter developed standardized, teachable approaches for applying the grid to multilingual print communication. Their contribution was less about invention and more about systemization, transforming long-standing human practices into a modern design framework. So if we take a look at these examples here, Emil Reuter, 1959, Joseph Mueller-Brockmann, 1955, we see these gridded, column and baseline alignment approaches, even with the illustrations. Here's a grid turned on its axis at an angle to create some engagement. So this is what I call making and breaking the grid. Which is one of my favorite things to do, is sort of play with grid and proportion. And from these practices, they were able to form a practice of pedagogy. So from practice to pedagogy means from doing to teaching. And so if you come to the GMD Design Library on campus, we have a copy of this book in there. You can check it out. grid systems, raster system. Notice the multiple languages. So a big thing that was driving the need for these gridded systems was that all of these artists and designers who took refuge in Switzerland did not all speak the same language, and there was a need to publish multilingual books. So a book that might be in English, French, German, um, all, multiple languages, and needing to be organized in a way that a reader could follow through depending on which language they spoke. So the practical application of the grid in graphic design. In graphic design, the grid serves as a foundation upon which organizational systems are built. By dividing the design plane, whether it's a page, a frame, or even a physical environment, into structured units, grids provide a framework for arranging content and information with clarity and intention. So, an effective grid is not arbitrary. It is thoughtfully crafted to align with the nature of the content it is showcasing, and the context in which it will appear. So, this adaptability ensures that the grid supports both the functionality and the aesthetics of the design. The art of grid design lies in achieving this delicate balance, maximizing the adherence to a set of guiding principles, maximizing adherence to a rule with the most amount of space for creative freedom. So, in other words, finding the sweet spot between consistency and variation. So, one of my favorite examples or illustrations for this is the Transworld Surf redesign. You can click on the link in the slide deck and read a whole case study. But I think they do a really good job, especially for students, helping you understand how a grid system works, how the foundation exists, and then how it becomes like a modular tool for organizing information in a publication across many pages. So the part where it talks about it thinks about the content it will hold and the context in which it appears. So Transworld Surf is a magazine. It is going to hold long form content like essays and interviews, and it's going to hold short form content like we see on the first page here, lists of names, editors, articles, table of contents, right? So small to large pieces of content on a printed page. And what we see here is the two grids that they're using throughout their document. And even, it's not even these two things are really two grids, it's two illustrations of the same grid. So what we see here is the grid broken down into its smallest units, these squares. But if we were to fill this in, we end up with this page, right? So it's slightly larger square. And then you can imagine if we filled this in, and then we filled that in, right? Sort of like zooms out. And what you can see up here is this really beautiful illustration of here is, when we do our thumbnail sketches and I do the demo about how to use markers and different colors to just sort of block out areas of composition, those thumbnail sketches tend to look like this, right? We have these gray columns representing body copy, red representing images, black representing headers and footers. And if we look, we can see that this page translates into this page. We can see a placeholder for this image right here, this image right here, two columns of text, two columns of text. And if we look at this, we can also see how that came from here, right? We have here's one column of text, here's a second column of text, right? Larger image, headers, everything is adhering to this grid system. But this grid system gives enough flexibility that you can lay out a page with this many small elements, and also lay out a page with larger, long-running elements. So why do we use a grid in the first place? I love these images as an example of why a grid. So what we see on the left is a closet, a space that should be organized, but has no grid that responds to the type of content it's holding. What goes into a closet? Shirts, pants, shoes, maybe backpacks, tote bags, hats. And what we have in this closet is a grid that does not acknowledge the content, right? We have these single racks up here, some plastic hangers, there's no shelving. It is a disorganized mess We cannot navigate this space. We cannot find what we need. But then if we head over to this closet, this grid, we see space broken up into units in a way that considers the content that this space must hold. So we see columns and racks that consider what is the average length of a shirt or dress and pants. We have smaller units down the middle that can hold smaller pieces of content, right? So this is content without a grid. This is content with a grid. A well-crafted grid responds to the content it supports. It's thoughtfully attuned to scale, purpose, and context. Think about creating a home for all of the content within a layout. By anchoring text and images to a page, a screen, or a physical space, grids guide the user's eyes and create natural flow through the material. It's wayfinding. We know that in a grid, if a header lands in this area, when we get to the next page using the same grid, we're going to find the header in the same spot. We don't have to keep relearning the system every time we flip the page. So this balance of structure and clarity allows users to engage with the design intuitively with less disruption. So the TLDR is a grid makes it easier to find content, especially when paired with hierarchy. So grid types within the design deliverable. We talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but here's a little bit more of a nuanced description. A document grid aligns objects. So what we see here, this red grid, that is our document grid. It's a proportional regulator for composition of tables and pictures and graphs, illustrations, color blocks, while a baseline grid aligns texture type. So the baseline grid is the beginning of a numerical system on which decisions about type, sizes, and spacing should be made. What do we mean here? So look at our baseline grid, our blue line. So baseline grids in InDesign, you can customize your baseline grids. Your type, in order to make good use of the baseline grid, needs to have a numerical or proportional relationship with the baseline grid. So, for example, if a baseline grid is set to 4 points, that means the baseline shows up every 4 points from the one before it. All decisions about your type size and leading, so that's the spacing between lines, should be made in consideration of the number 4. Also, because the number 4 is an even number, it has a common denominator in the number 2, gives you a little bit of flexibility. But for example, in this document, the body copy might be 8 points, and the leading between lines would be 12 point. Both 8 and 12 are divisible by the number 4. And if we follow the math of it, what we will see if we turn on our baseline grid visibility in InDesign is that all of our lines are lining up with that baseline grid. So I want you to think about if the baseline grid, this is my favorite setting, was set to 3, which means every blue line shows up every 3 points of measure. What would you set for your body copy? What type size is legible and divisible by 3? And then what would your leading be? So what number is also divisible by 3? Bumps up, right? So 9/12 would be a good body copy typesetting. And then as you move into things like headers and subheaders, a header might be 21 points, right? You see that? And everything's divisible by 3. And your subhead might be 15, right? So every decision that you make is divisible by the number 3. This creates proportional harmony on the page, and it makes the entire composition look more appealing. It looks smarter, more intelligent, because of that proportional harmony. Our eyes, our brains like it. So grid types, there are some types of grids, ways to break up the units on the page in order to serve your content. And so in this example, we're looking at a single column, 2 columns symmetrical, 2 column asymmetrical, and 3-column symmetrical. There, you can keep going and keep going, but for example, let's focus on these 4 approaches to breaking up a page. Which grid would you use for a newspaper? Right? If we're thinking about line length, we want a line length of 35 to 65. We're going 9/12 on text. Should we use a single column grid for a newspaper? Probably not. We're going to wind up with like 130, 140 characters across a single line, right? So because the format on a newspaper is larger, we want to break it up so that we can create smaller columns. 3 or 4 column grid is what you will commonly find in a newspaper. What about a novel, a smaller book, right? With generous margins, something portable, 35 to 65 characters per line. We're going to go with a single column, right? This is a smaller column in a smaller format, or sorry, larger column in a smaller format. For a magazines, we may see the 2-column symmetrical, right? If it's an interview, questions and answers. If it's an essay, we may see a single column layout. If there's a recipe inside that magazine, we might get this 2-column asymmetrical layout, right? For things like ingredient list and then instructions. What about for a website? What would you use for a website? Our traditional websites tend to have primary content. It's an asymmetrical. So we have our primary content in the middle, and then to the right and to the left, we have skinny columns that include nav, advertisements, links to other things. So this is a pretty traditional layout for early web. So there are grids everywhere. Once you know about grids, you can't help but see them. They're woven into nearly every form of visual communication. You'll find them shaping the tight columns of magazines and academic books, structuring the rhythm of a novel, guiding wayfinding systems in subways, and even determining the proportions of the app icons on your phone. Your phone screen, your home screen with all those little apps, that's a grid. And even that grid has a design grid within it, right? So grid that identifies tappable space. Um, so whether we notice them or not, grids create invisible architecture that aligns text, spacing images, balancing shapes, and creating order in chaotic information environments. So think about navigating a subway, right? These subway signs, this gridded layout, color coded, rigid typographic system so that you don't have to relearn the system with every new station, right? You can move from one station to the next and instantly know which sign is the sign that has the information you need to get to your next place. So our monster of type for this week is Vanessa Zuniga Tinizare. She is also known as Amuki, which means inner silence. She's an Ecuadorian graphic designer whose practice centers on the visual languages of ancestral Latin American cultures. Her research-driven approach blends indigenous symbolism with contemporary tools, ranging from processing and creative coding to motion design. She generates new visual systems and stories that are both vibrant and deeply rooted in cultural memory. If you click through, it'll take you to her website and you can browse some of the projects that she's created. She is really well known for creating these gridded systems of type using processing, so code language. I encourage you to go explore her work. It's pretty fun. That's grids. Hope you enjoyed yourself. Keep learning. Move on to some of the other lectures and keep learning about type and typography.